Welcome to the Intimate Marriage Podcast, where I teach educated, successful couples how to have incredible, passionate relationships so that you can stop compromising and start feeling fully alive in your relationship. I'm your host, Alexandra Stockwell, aka the Intimacy Doctor. I'm a physician and an intimate marriage expert. My husband and I have been married for 26 years. We have 4 children and full professional lives, and we've created an amazing relationship. I've also shown hundreds of couples how to do so as well. If you want to deepen your understanding of your own relationship and learn to access new heights of emotional, sensual, and erotic intimacy, you're in the right place. I will show you how. Now let's dive in. Let me set the scene. It was February 2003. My husband and I had been married for 7 years, and during that 7 years, we had learned a great deal about ourselves and one another. We'd already had some really wonderful couples coaching. We had learned to improve our communication. We had come to understand that compromise was really not going to work for us, even though we had not yet mastered the art of uncompromising intimacy and always speaking up and being true to ourselves with kindness. That was yet to come. Having an extraordinary, gratifying sex life was also yet to come. But in February of 2003, we had a good, solid, happy marriage that felt collaborative, and we could trust one another to be on the same page. And there was a lot of support. And I guess another way I would say it is that we had gone from sometimes bad to good, and were really settled in there and could smell what it might look like to go from good to great, outstanding, fantastic, extraordinary. But we weren't there yet. Anyway, February 2003, our marriage just started to feel weird to me. And we'd been through enough for me to recognize that this was different. I didn't feel like he was mad at me. I wasn't mad at him, but we were disconnected and there wasn't anything to account for it. There wasn't anything that was happening in my body or soul. There wasn't anything external that had occurred or some topic that was complicated for us. And while I definitely didn't always know what the content was, I was very familiar with feeling when there was something brewing in him. He might not even have been aware of it yet, but I could perceive there was something going on that was somehow complicated and needed his attention and or our attention. And this was not like that. It just, I don't really have vocabulary to describe it, but at the time I just felt like there was something weird happening in our marriage, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I just knew that we were becoming less connected. And at the time, I was seeing a really fantastic therapist. It was a few months after my mother had died, and I needed her help to walk through my grief of being in my 30s and losing my mother. And in the context of all of this, I shared that my marriage just felt weird and I couldn't put my finger on it. And this wonderful therapist said to me, "How old is Josephine, our oldest child?" And at the time she was 6. And then she asked me, "How old was Rod, my husband? How old was he when his parents got divorced?" And the answer was also 6. And I could see that what she wasn't quite saying, but there was a resonance there. There was something happening that wasn't objectively about me, but it was the matrix of family identity, experience, and dynamics. I know that sounds vague, but it was vague for me. Anyway, I went home And I carefully shared this with my husband, how things had been feeling weird to me and how I had told my therapist and how she had responded. And my husband is a remarkable man, and he heard this, and I saw confusion on the edges of his soul suddenly shift into clarity. And over the next day or two, I realized our marriage no longer felt weird at all. And he wiped away a few stray tears that escaped from his eyes. And he had been completely unaware. This was totally unconscious. But once I shared what my therapist had said, it came to consciousness, and he started to feel this deep, wrenching sorrow, because he looked at our daughter Josephine, who was 6, in a happy, solid family, feeling loved by her parents and innocent, radiant, empowered, joyful, sad when she was sad. She wasn't actually mad that often, but mad when she was mad, and just experiencing a range of emotions, sometimes wanting to be with other people, sometimes wanting to be alone. She just was this balanced, wholesome, healthy 6-year-old. And my husband looked at her and thought about when he was 6 and how he never had an opportunity to be 6 and live in such a healthy, aligned, connected way where he could trust the world and trust himself. And there was something about being a caring, devoted adult father and seeing our daughter at 6 that opened a window, opened a whole landscape, a new way of relating to his own childhood experiences. Now, let me say, it's not that he wished his parents had stayed married or that he was upset or victimized. None of that in his case. It's more that he had been profoundly influenced by something. It had shaped who he is and how he related to himself and to me, his wife. And he hadn't ever seen it as clearly as he was able to by seeing the contrast in how dynamic and just solid and confident and radiant Josephine was. It helped him begin to reclaim a way of being that had been kind of collateral damage as his family reorganized itself when his parents got divorced. And there's a lot more to say about how that played out in his biography, but it's not really pertinent right now. The main thing that I want to share is, first of all, that this weirdness and emerging disconnection in our relationship was activated in this way. And secondly, this part is really important. Once he could see it consciously, it no longer influenced our marriage. It no longer had a power over our experiences. It no longer unconsciously sneaked in and influenced the emotional milieu in our relationship. Not at all. Once he could see it clearly, then he really had an opportunity to do all kinds of things, whatever it took to reacquaint himself with parts of himself that he'd been divorced from as his parents had gotten divorced. Interestingly, we have 4 children, and something actually quite similar, it felt like an echo, happened when our second child was 6 years old. But this time, I recognized it, I brought it up, and it didn't really have much impact on our marriage. It's more just that I could feel it there. and kind of handed it to my husband to handle again. And then with our third child, it was so diluted, it might not have even been an issue, except that I mentally had it in my calendar for when he turned 6 to have my eyes out for this. And so it was more like a whiff of that. And it provided more integration, more growth, more learning, more reclamation, more feelings that had been compartmentalized on the part of my husband. And by the time our fourth child turned 6, this just was a non-issue. It didn't happen. So what are you thinking? Is there a way in which you look at your child or children, nieces and nephews, and it's really our own children that impact us in this way, but not only. Anyone that you're really close to can be a mirror for what your experience was or was not when you were the same age. It's one of the gifts our children give us, is a kind of revisiting of our childhood experiences, both the beautiful, tender, innocent, positive experiences and the ones that were complicated and not integrated, that we compartmentalized and essentially disconnected from an aspect of ourselves. There's an opportunity as an adult to feel those feelings and integrate the parts of ourselves that we've disconnected from. This came up for a client of mine that, I spoke with him, in early 2021. And they had been married for 8 years. The context was different. It wasn't triggered by having an adolescent, but certain things happened that she wasn't aware of it. But basically, she went from being this mature, competent, ambitious professional woman to at home feeling like an adolescent, kind of out of control with all that energy, wanting to break rules, wanting to say no. And she actually stepped away from her corporate position and wanted to start, I don't remember if it was a yoga studio or Pilates studio, nothing particularly radical, a perfectly wonderful thing, but it was really a way of completely walking away from what she had built up over the years and always been devoted to. She just did 180 degrees. At home, she went from being collaborative to really being an adolescent. Sometimes, it's much more common that women joke that if they have 2 children, they talk about having 3 children, referring to the husband as a child. Well, this was the opposite situation. And this husband, who himself had tended to be the more irresponsible one, found himself stepping up and needing to create boundaries and stick to rules, and really wondered what the heck had happened to his wife, because he felt like he was living with an unruly teenager. And he was supposed to parent, but he was not actually the parent. Now, for the 2 of them, it was a much more complicated thing to transition out of this dynamic than it was for me and my husband, partly because my husband was always devoted to his personal growth and had lots of tools and had experiences like this before, not within our marriage, but in other parts of his life where something had come up and he had figured out how to navigate it. So in the case of my clients, it was new territory, and neither of them really realized this dynamic of her becoming an adolescent. And in her case, once I named it, it was helpful some of the time, but she still felt like breaking rules and coming in after her curfew and just being outrageous in a way that he had never seen before. And she had never seen before, because in adolescence, things were happening and she just studied hard and compartmentalized and never felt any of that fierce, rebellious intensity, because she was in a situation where she couldn't really rock the boat like that. She needed to keep a lid on it, keep her head down, and just really focus. And so it was only 8 years into her marriage that things actually were safe enough for her to go back in and feel all those feelings that she'd never felt before. What are you hearing when I share all this? My hope is that you open your eyes to seeing how, when things are challenging with a spouse, even though in our society, the first thing we tend to do is blame the spouse, want the spouse to change, that often enough, the situation does not inherently have anything to do with the spouse other than the spouse being present and committed to you and in an intimate relationship, which itself creates a context for this other stuff to arise. If you're in a challenging phase, if things are coming up, I recommend that you ask yourself if you have any feelings that maybe belong to a different time in your life. I guess I would also say that whatever tools you have, they're going to be a good place to start in navigating this kind of a very complex conundrum. So I would love to hear what insights you have, what thoughts you have. Feel free to send me a message on Instagram or Facebook. I'll definitely read it and respond. Or join my Facebook group. It's called the Intimate Marriage Facebook Group with Alexandra Stockwell, MD. And it's a place to have the kinds of conversations that I'm having here on the podcast, learn from other people's experiences, and see what insights you can have and integrate into your own marriage to have more authenticity, sovereignty, happiness, and pleasure. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Intimate Marriage Podcast. If you're ready to deepen your relationship and create a truly intimate, delicious, and vibrant marriage, head over to alexandrastockwell.com and choose the program that's right for you.